Hi folks, and welcome to the channel, and in this video we're going to look at the BMW R1200R. This is a big bike, and the first time I saw it I got a bit scared. I came from a 310 BMW, which is a small bike compared to this one, and then the size of this bike scared me a bit, especially the big engine. But then again, I got onto the bike and I drove it, and my conclusion at the end was, this is not a big bike, this is a small big bike. It is a big bike, but it behaves like a small one. I drove on the highway, I drove in the city, I drove in between cars in traffic queues, and this bike maneuvers very well. So that's the good thing. I also think it holds the road very well. So I am very pleased with this bike. And right now it has about 5,000 clicks, so that's not that much, but still it works pretty well. The other thing about this bike is, and then I will stop talking about riding the bike, is the fact that the saddle is for me very low. I'm a shorty, I'm only 1.68 meters, and I can touch the ground with my both feet, which is a big benefit with a bike like this. So you can get different saddle heights. There are about 3 different heights that you can get. I got the lowest one on this bike, and that works perfectly for me. So when I got on this bike the first time for my test ride, it scared the living daylight out of me. I thought I couldn't drive a bike because the gearbox was making funny noises. Each time I started to shift the gear, I had a clunk. So this bike has a clunky gearbox. It's quite normal, and we'll talk about it later, but it's a bit intimidating the first time. It's a little bit embarrassing when you stand somewhere and there's a lot of people around and you put that bike in first gear and you go like clunk. You know, it's like you're not able to drive or you don't know how to drive. That's one thing, but it's not an issue. The second thing I found about this bike was that if you're driving it, it is a bit resistant when you're going into a curve. There's a little bit of force you have to put, not a lot, on the steering wheel to start turning, and that is something you have to get used to. For me, I wasn't used to that. I was used to a small bike, but now I'm used to it. After about a few hours driving it, you get used to it. But once the bike is in the curve, it's going on rails. You don't need to do anything. It takes you through the curve. So that's the other good thing. And then the other thing on this bike was that when you sit on it, you don't sit on the bike, but you actually sit in the bike, and that's another good feeling. Now, I'm leaning a bit forward because I'm a short guy and I like that, but normally you're sitting pretty much upright, which gives you a very comfortable riding position. It is a Driveshaft bike, and it feels a bit different than a chain-driven bike, but that you get used to as well, and we'll talk about this. So I think enough of these things, and you can see all this on many different YouTube movies, how the bike rides. We're going to put it on the table now and start looking at all the different parts. We'll look at the motor, we'll look at the injection system, we're going to look at the ignition, the cooling, we're going to look at the electrical systems, the ECUs, the braking system, all of that, and we'll explain the different modes, and I hope you will enjoy it as much as I do. So let's put the bike on the stand.
The bike has a traditional boxer engine by BMW, 2 cylinders mounted opposite to each other at 180 degrees. Each of the cylinders has a double overhead camshaft with 4 valves per cylinder. Contrary to most of the boxer engines, this engine is water-cooled but aided by air, and you can actually see that on the vents on the cylinders. So air and water are the combination on this bike. The engine displaces 1,170 cubic centimeters across the 2 cylinders with a compression ratio of 12.5 to 1. The motor develops 92 kilowatt at 7,750 RPM. The red line on the bike when at operating temperature is 9,000 RPM. The bike idles at 1,150 RPM. The top speed of this bike is over 200 clicks an hour, so that's quite performant for this kind of a bike. The bike is fully fitted with an injection system. There is a direct injection on every cylinder, and the ignition system is fully electronic with a direct coil over the spark plug. So no longer any high tension voltage leads. It's all directly plugged in. The whole engine is controlled by an ECU, electronic control unit, with a multitude of sensors. The total weight of this bike is 231 kilograms. You can add an additional 290 kilograms of load, but you should never exceed a total mass of 450 kilograms. Now that is the bike and the load together. This bike really drives very smoothly. Acceleration is great even at low RPMs because the torque curve is very smoothly distributed.
Just behind the front fork you will find the radiator, and on top of that on the right hand side you have a filling cap, but that's not the cap you should be using to fill up or top up the cooling liquid. Now keep in mind that the cooling system is pressurized, so that way the boiling temperature of the cooling liquid is increased. There is a kind of a pressure relief valve and an expansion tank which is sitting on the top. You can see the upper and the lower level, and the liquid should be right in the middle. It's a monoethylene glycol, protecting the bike for corrosion but also anti-frost at the same time. And filling it up is through the cap all the way on the top. That's where you have to do it. Not an easy and comfortable place to do it, but it is doable. You have to bend the bike over a little bit to the side and turn the steering wheel. And the motor uses spark plugs like any other bike. However, the spark plugs are hidden behind this piece of plastic here. You will need a torque screwdriver to remove that panel. So the spark plugs are right behind this cover here, and on the top of the spark plug you have your high tension coil. There is no longer a separate coil, so that way we avoid high tension leads. Now if you have to work on the spark plug or remove it or clean it or whatever you have to do with it, you will have to disconnect this plug, and then you need to pull out this high tension coil which fits on top of the spark plug, and that's a bit of pulling, so you might need a special tool for that. But even then, if you want to move out the spark plug itself, the standard tool like we used to know it for spark plugs is not going to work. So if you're planning to remove the spark plugs yourself, you've got to have the right tools for this BMW. I don't know why people always do this when they build bikes, why not using standard tools, but that's just the way it is. On the top you have your injector and you have access to the injector, but again you have to have a torque screwdriver and you can undo the screw and then lift that panel as well. Here we go. And here you have the injection system itself and the control, the pulses that come to the injector driven by the ECU to provide the proper amount of fuel injection at the right time. We have this on both sides, and on the top of the cylinder you will find the air intake, and there's a valve right here in the middle which is the air valve, which is going to be used together with your throttle. The oil filter sits on the left hand side on the bike underneath the cylinder and is very easy to remove, so I think BMW did a good job on that one. It's a very traditional filter, nothing special. If you do it in oil change or you need to top up the oil in the bike, then you will have to remove this cap here, and this is sitting on the right hand side of the bike, and it's specially keyed, so you're going to need a special tool for that, and I got the tool right here, and you can stick it in, and then if you have a bit of force you can turn it open, and then you can fill up the bike with additional oil. The tool to open up the oil plug is sitting underneath the passenger's seat, so you have to remove the seat first on the bike, and then you find a couple of tools here, and this is where it is. This is the screwdriver. At the same time you need to pull out that pin, and now you actually have that tool. Draining the oil out of the engine is done by the plug here all the way on the bottom on the engine block in between the two exhaust pipes. If you're going to change the oil on the bike, then you should use the proper synthetic oil 5W40, and it takes about 4 liters of oil to fill up the complete engine. Checking the oil level on this bike is easy. You have an hourglass on the right hand side of the bike, and you also have a check on the dashboard. While the engine is warm and vertical and running, you can check actually the level of the oil on the dashboard. On the right hand side of the bike you will find an hourglass, and that's where you can check the oil level, which should be sitting somewhere in the middle or a bit higher up. But in this case the bike is not running, so it's a bit more difficult to check it, because once the bike is running you will see that this level is going down a bit. We've looked on the injectors, we looked a little bit on the spark plugs, we didn't remove any, but what you see is a lot of cabling on this bike, a lot of cabling that goes to the engine. And this engine is fully controlled with what we call an ECU. And this is the ECU, or an electronic control unit, that is controlling the whole working of the engine. It will determine the right moment in time when the fuel needs to be injected. It will also determine how much fuel needs to be injected, and all of that is done by measuring different parameters all around the bike. It's going to measure the temperature of the cooling liquid. It's going to measure the temperature of the environmental air. It's going to measure the position of the crankcase. It's going to check the oxygen level that we have in the exhaust. And if you look close enough, here you will see the oxygen sensor, very critical. You have one on each side of the bike, and that will determine how good the combustion is, because the bike is going to try to apply a AFR, which is an air-fuel ratio of 14:1, so 14 parts of air and 1 part of fuel. That's the most optimum one. But of course, that's not going to be the case for all circumstances, because if the bike is cold, then you need more fuel to be injected than when the bike is warm. It's just like in the old days with your car. You need a choke then to start the car. Same thing here, and that's why the bike has all these sensors all around the bike, and all these sensors are connected over what we call a CAN bus, which is a common bus. It's actually only 4 wires, in fact only 2 wires. It's a ground and it's a plus 12 volts, and then you have a differential signal with a plus and a minus. Now all these sensors on the bike, they will have a unique address or unique name, if you want to call it, so they are uniquely identifiable, and whenever they report something to the ECU, then they will mark themselves as, I am this and I have this to say to you. So for instance, the temperature sensor for the cooling liquid will say, I'm the cooling liquid sensor and this is what I'm measuring right now. And all that data goes back into the ECU, and we'll look on the ECU in a few minutes. Now let's talk about the gearbox. This bike has a 6-speed gearbox, and the gearbox is 1 down and 5 up. And as I said before in this video, it's a clunky gearbox, and everybody who has driven a BMW of this type, or even other types, they know exactly what I mean. The first, second and third gear are very clunky, so whenever you push it in, it makes a clunk. Now that is quite normal, because the clutch in this bike is what we call a wet clutch, and the clutch runs in oil. It's the same oil as the engine itself. And a wet clutch has multiple discs. There are discs that are connected to the crankshaft of the engine. So each time the engine is running, these discs are running along with the engine. And then on the gearbox, on the prime shaft, you have another set of discs that are fixed to the gearbox. And these discs are interleaved with each other. And when the clutch is pulled on the handle, then this opens up and the discs are removed from each other. If you let the clutch go, then this comes together, and these discs are pushed against each other, and the rotational force of the engine is now transferred to the gearbox. That's how a wet clutch is working. But the term wet refers to the oil that's in between the discs. So if you pull the clutch, then these discs are going open, but in between them there is a bit of oil. And that oil causes a bit of a drag. So the discs that are connected to the engine are rotating. The discs connected to the gearbox shaft are no longer rotating, but because of the oil in between, it all rotates a little bit. So the gearbox prime shaft is running slightly. That means if you stand still and you push the bike into gear, and if you do that, make it swift and decisive, put it in gear, you will have the clunk. And it's normal. It gets even worse, the clunk, because this bike has a drive shaft towards the rear wheel. It doesn't have our traditional chain. But if you were to look on a bike with a traditional chain on and a wet clutch, have a look on the chain, what happens when you put it in first gear. You see that move a bit, because that slack you have on the chain. Now with the drive shaft, you don't have that one. So combine the drive shaft together with a wet clutch and the BMW design, I would say, and then you have that clunking sound. It is not a problem. It's built for that. It's rigid enough. It can deal with that, because this whole system is very solid. And by the way, guys, a wet clutch is very forgiving, very strong, and very good. And for the clutch, you need to remove the cover, but always make sure that the cover is clean. But here you have to use mineral oil. Don't forget that one, and you should refer to the owner's manual. But I like what BMW does. They have all the warnings on top of the covers, and that's really a good thing to have. It also tells you what to use, and I think this is a very good point for BMW. I just mentioned that this bike has a drive shaft, and the drive shaft starts from the front of the bike and goes all the way to the end to the rear end of this bike, and here is another gear system which is driving the wheel actually. And as you can see, this is a very rigid construct. This is the BMW construct, very good, high quality, and it's a drive shaft. And I mentioned it before in the beginning that if you drive a drive shaft bike, you have this little bit of a movement each time you throttle up in full, but you get used to that. So that by itself is great, because I like this drive shaft, because that doesn't give me any more grease on my rim or on my legs or whatever. No more need to adjust the chain, no more need to grease the chain. This is great. And this is a view on the rear wheel. And as you can see, the rear wheel has no support here on this side. It only has it on the other side, on the left-hand side. That's where we had the drive shaft. So basically this wheel is almost mounted like it was a car, right? You see the bolts right here, and this is how you have to remove the wheel. Very interesting design, but a very good design by BMW, and very well known as well. The rims themselves, well, those are all alloy wheels in one piece. These are the rear brakes on the bike, and they are the Brembo type with double cylinders on it and a single disc in the back. In the front of the bike you find the Brembo calipers, one on the left, one on the right, with double cylinders on it, so this produces quite some braking force, and the brake hoses are braided as well. Now that is a very good braking system. The brake discs on this bike are cross-drilled, and it gives you additional cooling both in the back and in the front. And it wouldn't be a BMW if we did not have the double ABS system, meaning that the front and the rear ABS system is working independently. This disc here with all these little openings is going to rotate with your wheel, and on the other side you will find a sensor, and the sensor will detect all the openings and generate kind of a pulse signal. The faster the wheel will run, the higher the frequency of the pulse will be, and that information is fed to the ABS system and the ECU of the bike. This bike has an ABS system, an anti-blocking system, or an anti-block or slip system. That means that when you drive this bike and you're pulling the brakes and it's a slippery road, that the wheel will not block. And you've seen the disc in the front of the bike, whereby we had all these little pulses going back to the ABS pump, which is somewhere underneath the saddle of this bike. Well, whenever you pull the brakes and you're driving and the wheel blocks because it's slippery, then the pulses will stop on that disc, and your ABS pump will detect it together with the controller, and then it will relieve the pressure momentarily on the brake pads. No matter if you squeeze hard or not, it's not going to matter. It's going to relieve that pressure a bit so that the wheel keeps rotating again, and your wheel will be going in chunks. It is actually blocking the wheel, but very, very shortly. So this prevents you from actually falling or slipping. So that's the ABS system. You can turn it on or off. This is your choice. It's on the steering handle where you can control that. And BMW added a couple more features on this bike that increase the safety of riding this bike. The first one is what we call the ASC, which is the automatic stabilization control. What this does is that when you're driving the bike, the speed of the front and the rear wheel will be constantly measured. If there is a certain difference in speed, in other words, there is a slip, maybe the front wheel is slipping, maybe the rear wheel is slipping because you're throttling up and you start spinning that wheel. If there is a slip between either one of them, then the ASC will reduce the power on the motor. In other words, the slipping will disappear, and it will keep reducing the power until that difference in speed of the wheels is removed. So that's one. It's a great system, and it really protects you very well on slippery roads or icy roads. The other system that this bike has is what we call dynamic traction control, DTC. And DTC works very similar to ASC, but it has an inclination sensor. So if the bike leans over in a curve, you're going into that curve, the combination of the curve and the difference in speed of the wheels because of the slippage will be another indication to reduce the power on the motor so you stay on track. That's what the DTC does. So the combination of ASC and DTC together makes the ride very safe. So it's going to be very hard with this bike to do a wheelie, but then again you can turn off the safety features, and that's what you do with the ABS control button, and you can also decide how much the effect will be of this ASC and the TDC because you can set the driving style. You have road, rain, and in fact you even have a user mode where you can define things, or dynamic, that's the other one. Now this bike doesn't have the dynamic one, I only have rain and road mode, and this is nothing more than setting the tolerances is different for the ASC and the DTC. So meaning that one does it kick in, one is the power reduced on the motor. So that's for the safety systems. Now I know some of the bikes have even electronic control from the suspension. This bike doesn't have it. I only have manual controls on that bike, especially on the rear where there is a monoshock absorber. So let's have a look at that. The monoshock, it's a spring and a shock absorber at the same time. A very well known system, very good suspension. And you can adjust the strength of the spring, so the pressure of the spring, by this knob. So you can increase it or you can decrease it. And you do this according to your own likings, to your own weight, and if you are loaded or not loaded with extra baggage or not. By the way, this bike is around 231 kilograms, I think, and it can take another 219 kilograms, I believe. So it's roughly around 420 kilograms total load on this bike. And with this, you can adjust a little bit the road handling. It is recommended to use it in a soft mode whenever you go on very uneven surfaces. There is another adjustment all the way on the bottom on this shock absorber, which is setting actually the softness of the shock absorber itself, which is the same thing as on a car where you have regulated shock absorbers. The knob is all the way on the bottom, and I don't know if you can see it, but it's all the way over there. So the brake fluid reservoir is on the right hand side, just above the driver's footrest, and you need to check that the level is right. There is an indication on that one. That's an easy one to double check. The front brake fluid can be checked on an hourglass at the right hand side of the steering wheel, and you have to make sure that the level is always above this line. Another great feature I like about the handles is that they are adjustable, and here you have a dial. You can adjust it between 1 and 4. So if you are having very short fingers like I do, then you can bring the lever closer to your hand. It makes it easier to brake or to use the clutch. You have it on both sides, the clutch and the front brake. Or you can turn it wide open if you're one guy or lady with very long fingers, but that's less comfortable for me. So this is really a nice feature to have on this bike. I think BMW did a good job with that one. Some people asked me once, why is this little cut here, this reduction in thickness? Well, that is there just in case you fall, then this will bend over or then eventually break off. If you're going to fill up the brake fluid for the front and rear discs, make sure that you use .4 brake fluid and always use fresh brake fluid, because it tends to absorb humidity and water because it's glycol based. You could use 5.1 and 5, those are compatible with .4, but be very careful, it's better to stick to .4. 5.2, never use that because that's silicone based brake fluid. If you mix that with .4, you're going to be in deep trouble. This engine requires a lot of power from the starter motor to crank it over, so a lot of amps will be drained from the battery whenever you crank the bike. Now, especially in the winter, batteries are not very good when it's cold, so their capacity goes down. So therefore, BMW has foreseen a charging method while you're stalling your bike. Maybe you stall your bike for a week or two because it's icy or rainy and you don't want to drive your bike in the winter or whatever. There is a plug foreseen on the bike on the right hand side, and that's where this plug is, right here. Now this plug allows you to connect a tickle charger or a tender charger, which is a charger that is going to keep topping up your battery so it doesn't run empty. Because even if you turn off the ignition on your bike and remove the key, the bike is still going to use some power for its clock and some circuitry inside the ECU or the control unit of this bike. In fact, if you plug in a tender or a charger into this socket here, it may not work always, because you need to get a charger or tender which is CAN bus compatible, because this plug is CAN bus controlled. And remember the CAN bus that we talked about before? That's the communications bus that we have on this bike. Now that is not very good. I don't like this at all. I would actually modify that if I was you. But again, that's what it is. But of course we can always charge the battery direct in its battery bay. So let's have a look on how we can get to the battery. The battery is held behind this plastic panel, and you're going to need a torque screwdriver to undo that part. And then you can just pull it out. So if you really need to charge the battery, because it's flat, then you will have to remove it if you don't have a charger that is CAN bus compatible. You need a spanner 10, and you remove the negative on the battery. There we go. And then normally this plastic piece comes off, and you'll have to tweak it a bit. I already did it, I already messed around with it, but this is how it comes off basically, right? You can take that off, and then there's kind of a rubber on it, and you can remove this spanner here, and now you can grab the battery and actually slide it out. And you need to lift it a little bit, and then it really comes out like so, and then here you have the positive side. By the way, this positive side is going back to this plug over here, so that's the same point. And then you can charge it, and then you can put it back. There we go. Or actually replace the battery. Now I'm not going to do a maintenance video now, but I just wanted to show you that. If you remove the side panel on the bike, you will find the diagnostics plug, and this is the diagnostics plug right here. You can read out the error codes on your bike, so whenever you have the little motor indication, the ML function light is on, that means the fault is logged. One of those sensors in the bike has detected a fault. And then you could use an OBD2 reader to read out the error code. This is a very cheap €24 OBD2 reader that you can normally connect to this diagnostics plug, and as you can see, it supports CAN as well, besides many other protocols. However, the default connector is this, and that doesn't connect to this plug. So therefore, you will need what we call a conversion plug, and this is a conversion plug. This side will go on there, and the other side will go to your OBD2 reader. I have seen a lot of debates on OBD2 and CAN bus. So here is a little explanation, and you can skip it if you want. But OBD2 stands for Onboard Diagnostics, version number 2. And it's an agreed standard between all the major manufacturers. It's kind of a book, and a book with chapters, and every chapter defines a very specific part of the bike. Maybe it's all about the injection system, maybe it's all about the ignition system. And within each of these chapters, then you have paragraphs, and they describe every little component of the injection system and the ignition system. So it's always in the same place. And it also defines what you should find there in terms of information. So that's the book. That's OBD2. Now, unfortunately, BMW does not stick to that alone. They have more things. They have very specific things for BMW. So they have kind of a BMW annex to it, and this annex you cannot read with an ordinary OBD2 scanner tool. For that one, you're going to need a special BMW tool. But in general, you don't need this. The bike provides you sufficient information over the standard OBD2 scanning tool, but you can't use any tool you want because the bike speaks a certain language. Although we all use the same book, but the language is different from book to book. There's a book in German, there's a book in English, there's a book in Italian or Chinese, whatever. Not really a language, but to give you a comparison. So if I have an OBD2 reader and I connect it to the bike, it better talks the same language of my bike. So the CAN bus, that is a language. So the CAN bus, that's what we call a protocol. So you can have different protocols. You have the K-line, you have a lot of ISO protocols, and the CAN bus protocol. So if you're getting an OBD2 reader, then make sure it can do CAN bus, because that's what this bike talks, CAN bus. So you've got to make sure it's compatible with that. And then you can read out things. Now the interesting part on this bike is that you can have faults, and this little ML light comes on your dashboard or the TFT screen. And depending on the fault, the bike will go in emergency mode or the bike will continue to ride. It could be that the air sensor, for instance, is just having a glitch and it gives the wrong indication for a few seconds. Well, that will be a fault because the ECU will say something is wrong with it and it will log it as a fault. But it's not going to affect the bike because the sensor started to work good again afterwards. So you can keep on driving and you won't see it. But you have the light on. Now you're going to need an OBD2 scanner to read out that fault and to clear it. Otherwise you cannot remove the light on your TFT screen on the dashboard. Other faults can be far more severe, and some of them are actually dangerous for the motor or the engine to get damage to it, and they will force the motor into an emergency mode. So you won't have a lot of power, but enough to get to the nearest BMW service center or to your own garage or workshop if you want to do the work yourself. The red line of the engine is 9,000 RPM, and that's when it's working at its operating temperature at around 80 to 85 degrees centigrade. And the nice thing about it is that there is an indication on the dashboard on what the red line is at different temperatures. But right now, the engine temperature is 13 degrees centigrade. And you'll see that the red line right now is 4,000 RPM, and that will shift while the engine is getting warmer. So I'm just going to let the bike run for a few minutes, and then you'll see how that will actually go up. Temperature right now is 40 degrees centigrade, and now you see a jump to about 5,000 RPMs. That's now the red limit, around 40 degrees centigrade of engine temperature. And that's going to go up all the way to 8,000 as soon as the engine has reached its normal operating temperature. There you saw another jump at 50 degrees centigrade, it jumped to 6,000 RPM. So I think BMW did a real good job on this. I really like this kind of a setup. The fuel tank on this bike holds about 17 liters of fuel, and it's recommended to drive it with 95 or 98. If you're going to drive with methanol-based fuel, then you have to make some special arrangements, and it's not really recommended. The fuel consumption on this bike is, in my case, really good. I've done about 1,000 clicks with this bike. I drove in the city, I drove in traffic queues, I drove on the highway, high speed, and my average consumption was 4.5 liters. So guys, I know this is a bit incredible, 4.5 liters, but that's reality. Of course, it depends on your own driving style, but let's have a look if I'm lying or not. And here you have actually the consummation for the last 1,000 clicks I've done with this bike, and it's 4.5 liters per 100 kilometers. Really good, so the gas tank gets me around 330 to 350 clicks. As you notice, the gas tank is like half empty or half full, and the range is still 203 clicks, so that's really good. So that confirms my 4.5 liters really. And my average speed was 53 clicks an hour, but that's because I drove in the city, in traffic queues, and on the highway, so it's a combination of all of it. We talked about the automatic stabilization control system, we talked about the dynamic traction control system, and all that is influenced by the mode. And right now we've got the mode set to road. You can change the mode if you press the button, and there's a mode button on the right hand side, and you can set it to rain if that's what you want. And then of course there's another mode which I don't have on this bike, which is dynamic or user. Now this bike only has road and rain. Now the difference on the modes is the time that the ACS and the dynamic traction control system is kicking in. So how much does it reduce the power? What is the threshold limit between the front wheel speed and the rear wheel speed before it's kicking in? In rain mode, it's very sensitive and it will reduce the power very quickly. And in road mode, it will be far less sensitive. So you can have a bit more slippage or difference in speed between the front and the rear wheel. If you go to dynamic mode, which this bike doesn't have, then it's even less sensitive. And if you go to user mode, then you can control many of the aspects yourself. On the left hand side of the steering handle, you'll find the ABS switch, and with this switch, if you're depressing it, you can turn off and on the ABS system and the ACS and some of the dynamic traction control features. So guys, I guess we are nearing the end of this video. I talked a lot, and I think this bike overall is a great bike. We haven't talked about the looks of it, but to me it's a crossbreed between a modern bike, a sports bike, a tourer, a city bike. It has a bit of everything, so that's what I like in the naked bike a lot. But anyway, I let you make up your own mind on this one, and please comment by any means on my videos because I don't know everything myself. But I would like to thank you for viewing and to be patient with me for such a long video. And now maybe I see you in my next video, or maybe we see each other on the highway somewhere. Bye bye.